So you think you want to be a solo diver. You know all about the gear, all about the extra stuff that you need to take with you. Do you know about the most important piece of gear that you're going to need to take with you on a solo dive? Do you have a self-reliant diver mentality? Let's find out. Welcome to Everything Scuba. Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Everything Scuba. I am Lyell. If you're a first-time viewer, welcome to our channel. We are here dedicated to talking about the beautiful sport of scuba diving. If you love to scuba dive into Everything Scuba. We'd love to have you join us on our weekly shows. We are continuing to talk about solo diving on this show. And in particular, we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty of the details of dive planning, dive calculations, and the things that solo divers must absolutely know before getting in the water. We've covered the gear. We've covered the essential pieces of redundant equipment that you're going to need. Today, we're going to talk about the most important piece of equipment that any diver has, and that's right here. You need to understand the concepts of dive planning, how to calculate your surface air consumption rate so you can appropriately plan for the amount of gas that you're going to require, and how do we do this safely? How do we plan a dive and execute it? How do we stick to that plan? So, first off, let's talk a little bit about the self-reliant diver mentality. As a self-reliant diver or solo diver, you are not going to have a buddy under the water to help you out if things go awry. As such, self-reliant divers have a little bit of a different mentality when it comes to dive planning and preparedness for diving. We are going to maintain our equipment. We are going to make sure it's serviced, up to date, and everything is functional. We are going to know all about the conditions associated with the dive site that we're going to dive at that day, the weather, current, surf, all the things that we need to know. We're also going to anticipate potential problems with that dive site. What could occur under the water and how do we prepare ourselves for that? And importantly, if we occur problems during the dive, we are not going to ignore particularly small problems. An accident of almost any size usually is a cumulative effect of small problems along the way that were ignored, missed, or not taken care of. And so we really want to prepare ourselves in a way to make sure that the best way to not get in an accident is to prepare yourself ahead of time to avoid that accident. First, let's talk about dive planning and formulating that dive plan. Things that we must fill our brain with prior to the dive. So let's think of dive planning in terms of 4 phases. The first, advanced planning for the dive. What is our objective? What do we want to accomplish while we're there? The dive site is going to probably hold that objective for us. And what are the logistics involved in getting ourselves to that site? Phase 2 of dive planning is preparation, making sure our gear is prepared, maintained, in good shape. Do we have tank fills? Is our redundant tank filled and ready to go? And looking ahead at potential conditions. So weather reports, you can use marine surf and tidal reports if you're diving in the ocean, and also potentially contacting the local dive shop who knows all about the conditions if they're diving there every day. Phase 3, last minute prep, day of the dive. Recheck conditions. Weather can change. Conditions can change from a couple of days ago that you maybe call the dive shop. Make sure things are good to go. Really important, tell someone where you are going, how long you're going to be there, and when to expect you back. Provide them with your contact information. If you're a rescue diver, you prepared an emergency action plan during that course. Probably doesn't hurt to put together a brief emergency action plan for any dive site that you're going to. Give it to the individual that is going to sit at home and wait for you to return. On that action plan, it's going to have local numbers for emergency personnel, the dive shop that they can contact if you haven't checked back in after a dive. Phase 4, you're at the dive site. Recheck the conditions for yourself. You know you've looked at the weather report on your phone and you walk outside and it's completely different from what it said on your phone. So go evaluate those site conditions, make sure it's still safe to dive by yourself that day. You will have a dive plan hopefully put together prior to arriving at that dive site that takes into depth, time considerations based on your surface air consumption rate, and we want to always stay within non-decompression limits as recreational divers. And as such, our plan does not include the use of a redundant gas. When we plan a dive, we want to make sure that we're planning it for our primary tank only. Your redundant gas is there for emergency purposes. It should not be part of your dive plan to consume your 80 cubic foot tank and then use your redundant gas. That's not how it works in the solo diving world. All of you remember from your open water class, BWRAF, Burgers with Rings and Fries. Bruce Willis releases awesome films. I'm sorry to you people who are Bruce Willis haters out there, but he does. You know he does. Armageddon, enough said. So, BWRAF, we're always going to do our pre-dive safety check. But because we have extra equipment, we need to make sure that's part of our pre-dive safety check too. So as much as we're going to check the air and breathe out our regulators from our main system, we're going to also check our redundant system, make sure that it's turned on, make sure we have the appropriate pressure that we expect to see, that we can breathe from that system, and all of the other redundant gear. BWRAF. One of the first things that you're going to learn in the classroom during a self-reliant class is how to calculate your surface air consumption rate. It's a little bit of a confusing thing for some divers because of the title. Why am I going to stay at the surface and breathe my air all the time? Well, technically we're not, but it gives us a measure of how much gas we're going to use in a given amount of time during a dive. And so, we got a quick little scuba doodle coming up. It's going to explain all about surface air consumption rates. And yes, we are going to have to do some math. My apologies. So your surface air consumption rate, or SAC rate, is a measurement of the amount of air you consume while breathing for 1 minute on the surface. Note, however, that your SAC rate is tank specific, meaning that it only applies to the exact size of cylinder that you used when you measured that SAC rate. So if you change your cylinder size at any point in time, you have to recalculate your SAC rate for that cylinder. Using that calculated surface air consumption rate, we can now more accurately predict the amount of gas that we will use at any given depth, and we'll show this using a calculation a little further in this scuba doodle. Also, it can help us plan for how much reserve gas that we need based on our personal surface air consumption rate. We always need that reserve gas in the event of an emergency only. So how do we go about calculating our own personal SAC rate? Here's one method. Dive at a level depth, say 20, 30, 40 feet of your choosing, and you're going to dive at that depth and stay there for a prescribed amount of time, swimming in a normal, easy fashion. It obviously goes without saying that while doing this, you should not infringe upon your non-decompression limits at any time. Make a note of your starting tank pressure at the start of your level dive. Then, at the end of your prescribed time, make a note of the ending tank pressure. The amount of gas that you have used during that time is obviously the starting amount minus the ending amount to give you the amount of gas that you used. Now comes the mathematical portion. This is for the imperial method, we're going to take the pressure used divided by the full working pressure of that particular tank times its capacity in cubic feet. We're going to divide that number by the depth in feet that you chose to do your level dive at, add 33 feet, and then divide that by 33. This is how we take into account the depth of the dive for the surface air consumption rate. Once we have that number, we're then going to divide it by the top number and then divide it by the time in minutes, i.e. how long did you do that level dive for. Ultimately, the answer you will have will be in cubic feet per minute. That is the amount of air that we'll use in cubic feet per minute. And for our friends who live in the rest of the world who may use the metric system, that calculation is just a little bit easier. You're going to use the pressure used or bar used times the cylinder volume in liters. You're going to divide that number by your depth in meters plus 10 meters divided by 10, and then divide that whole number by the time in minutes. You will ultimately end up with a calculation of liters per minute. So let's do an example just to make a little bit more sense of this. So we're going to dive for 50 feet for 10 minutes. The starting pressure is 3,000 psi. We use 800 psi during that 10 minutes, and our cylinder is an 80 cubic foot aluminum cylinder. Using that calculation method, our sac rate would be 0.85 cubic feet per minute. This number will allow us to continue to calculate all other numbers when dive planning and measuring gas needed for the dive and for reserve pressures. So that's a nice way for us to calculate surface air consumption rate. Remember, your surface air consumption rate can vary on a given day based on conditions, the environment that you're diving in, how your physiology is working that particular day. But this gives you a good general idea of just how much gas you're going to use on a given dive, and it allows you to add that to your dive planning calculations. We don't have time, and you probably don't have the patience for us to cover every single little calculation that would occur during a self-reliant diver class. But in addition to surface air consumption rates, we're going to have to figure out what is the total amount of gas that I'm going to need, what volume of gas am I going to need based on the depth and the time of where I'm diving. We have to calculate, in addition to that, my reserve pressure. There's a variety of ways that people can use calculations for dive planning. One of the most common one is the rule of thirds, meaning I'm going to use up the first third of my tank on the first part of my dive. My second third is going to be used on my return back to the boat or shore, and I leave a third in my tank as my reserve. And as we noted, the reserve is in your main primary tank. Your redundant gas system is not part of the calculation of your reserve gas. And lastly, the things that you're going to cover is you're going to work with an instructor and build a list of anticipated emergency scenarios, what could occur, and how would you respond to that. A self-reliant diver needs to have a self-reliant mentality to fulfill the primary objective of any dive, which, as you know by now, is to return safely from every dive. We have a saying in the scuba world. It says, plan your dive and dive your plan. Divers who get into trouble tend to deviate from the plan they made, or they didn't plan it in the first place. Well, hopefully we have given your most important piece of diving gear some additional information, things that you must know to become a solo diver. I know you love the gear, we love the diving, but our brain really needs to fill in all the details to make it work. Next up, we're finally going to go diving. We're going to show you the skills involved in the Self-Reliant Diver course, what you need to do to prove to us that you could become a solo diver. Click the link up above.